This video is to review the problems for 3.1, 3.2 practice quiz. So let's start with number 1. On number 1 it says match the graph with the domain. So domain means our x values. Okay? So our x values, we first want to look at our x-axis. So here's our x-axis going this way. So if we go to the left, the numbers get more negative, so that's going to be our x min, and as we work this way, our x values get more positive. So this is our positive, or our max. So let's start with our mins. So if we look at what's the smallest number, that x value that our graph goes to, well, at the very end of the graph we see an arrow, so that's showing that it's continuing. So that means it's going to go all the way to negative infinity. It's going to keep on going. And if we go to the other side, to the most positive number that it gets to, there's another arrow, which means it goes to positive infinity. So if it goes from negative infinity to positive infinity, that means the answer is all real numbers. Okay, so if we look at the second graph, we're still looking at domain, so x. So we're looking at the x-axis. So going to the left is our min, going to the right is our max. So the smallest x value that we hit, if we look right here, the graph stops here. So if we scroll down to our x-axis, that number is 1. So the minimum is going to be 1. And then if we look to what's the biggest x value, there's an arrow at the end when you go to the max side. So that means it's going to continue on, and it's going to positive infinity. Okay, so if we look at writing an inequality statement for that, that means for any values, any x values for our graph, they have to be greater than this one right here. So if we have x, all values need to be greater than or equal to 1, which matches with this one. Now if we look at this last one, we see that there's endpoints. And again, we're still looking at the x values. Okay, so we want to find the minimum, so that's going to be the furthest to the left, so our min, and we want to find our max, which is going to be on this side, right? So if we start with our minimum value in x that we go to, you see that the graph stops here. Okay, so this is our smallest x value, and if we go down to the x-axis, we see that that x value is -4. And then if we find the largest x value, we see the graph stops here. And so the x value at this location is 6. Is 6. So now I'm making an inequality statement for this graph. So our graph has to be in between these two numbers. So x needs to be greater or equal to -4, but it's less than or equal to 6. Okay, so those are your matching answers. Okay, so now we're going to go on to number 2. So number 2 says match the graph with the range. So range means the y value. So now we're looking at your y-axis. Okay, we're looking at our y-axis. So we want to find our minimum y value and our maximum y value. Well, the minimum is when your numbers get more and more negative. So our min y values are down here, and our max y values are up here. So if we want to find our minimum y value, we look at the lowest y value it goes to, we see we have an arrow. So an arrow means that we're going to continue on to negative infinity, remember, because we're getting more negative. And if we look at the other directions, the most positive y value we get to, we look and we see we have another arrow. So that means we're going to infinity in that direction too. So we're going from negative infinity to positive infinity, which means all real numbers. So then if we look at number 2, we're looking in the y direction. As you go down, your numbers get negative, so our minimum would be down here, our max would be up here. So we want to first see what's the smallest y value that we get to, or the lowest y value. So you see that right here, this is where we're stopping. So if we want to look over and see what our y value is, we can look at our y-axis and we see that that's 2. Then if we want to find our largest y value, we can look at the highest point that gets on the graph, but we see it's an arrow. And arrows mean that we're going to infinity, and because it's positive, that's the max, it's going to be positive infinity. So now if we want to write an inequality statement, we're going to say that, well, we know we're not going to be less than -2. All of our numbers have to be greater than or equal to -2, and there's no stopping point because they all go to positive infinity. So our y has to be greater than or equal to 2, which is one of our answers. And then we can go to this last one right here. Again, we're looking for the y, or the range. The minimum is down here, our most negative number. The max is up here. So if we start with the minimum, we see that the graph, the lowest or the smallest y value that we go to is right here. And if we find where does that hit the y-axis at, we can go over here, right? And that is -5. And then if we go up and see what's the largest y value hit, we see that that's right here, and that's going to be +4. So that means from an inequality statement that our y values have to be greater than -5, but then we hit here and there's no values above it, so it has to be less than 4. So y has to be greater than or equal to -5, but the values also have to be less than or equal to 4. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to number 3. So number 3 asks, find the functions values using the graph f of x below. Okay, so we have A, B, and C. So it's just asking us to find basically the coordinate pair. So what is our y value when x equals 1? Well, here's our x-axis. X equals 1 right here. So if we scroll up to our graph, right here we hit our graph and we know that our y value is 2. Okay, so we find when x equals 1, we hit our graph, and then we find what our y value is. So for B, we have a coordinate pair. So the first number of your coordinate pair is always your x value. The second number is your y value. So when y equals 4, what's x? Well, here's our y-axis. So when y equals 4, let's go ahead and hit our graph. Looks like it's going to touch there. What's our x value? Well, our x value is 5. Okay, so it just depends on if they're looking for x or y. So this last one, it says, what is f of 2? So our function notation says f of x is the same thing as saying y. Okay, so it's saying what is y? And they've already plugged in x for you. So do you see how here your x is replaced by 2? So we want to find y when x equals 2. So this is our x-axis. Here is 2 for the x-axis. We go up till we hit our function, and we find what our y value is, and we find that that is 3. Okay? So then if we go on to the next side, here's number 4. Answer the following question based on the graph of the relation below. So the graph of the circle above, or really it's a parabola, can best be described as is it a function or a relation? Well, we know because of the vertical line test, by drawing a vertical line through, and because we cross through it twice, we know that it's not a function. So, do you know if it's a function? Well, you can do the vertical line test. So this one is a relation. So now we want to know the domain. That's our x values of the graph below. So we're looking along the x-axis. We want to find the smallest x value and the largest x value. So the smallest x value right here, right, and our x value is 0. So the domain, so we go from 0, and our largest x value, well, we see that we have arrows, so it goes to infinity, to positive infinity. So that means from an inequality standpoint, all of our x values have to be greater than or equal to 0. Now if we look at our range represents our y values. So we're looking at this axis right here. If we look at our minimum y values and our maximum y values, well, we see at the minimum of our function, we have arrows. So that means we're going from negative infinity to positive infinity, because we also have arrows at the top, which that means that the range is all real numbers. So then if we look at answering number 5, the question is, in the standard xy coordinate plane, we have point 1, negative 5, and that's our midpoint. We have one endpoint, which is at 6, negative 2. And we want to find what is the other endpoint. So we could do this two ways. We could use the number line, or we could use an equation to solve. For this one, we're going to go ahead and use an equation. So we know that midpoint just means the middle or average. So we want to find the middle x value and the middle y value. So we can break that into two equations. So we have x, the midpoint, equals the endpoints added together divided by 2. My midpoint x value is 1. My endpoint that I know is 6. I don't know my other endpoint, and I have to divide by 2. Now to solve, I need to get x2 by itself. So I'm going to use opposite operations to get x2 alone. So right now I'm dividing by 2. So opposite operation is multiplication. Because this is a fraction, I'm going to go ahead and just write this side as a fraction. I'm going to write this side as a fraction. So what I do to one side, I do to the other. I'm going to multiply this also by 2. The 2's cancel out, and so I end up with 2 equals 6 plus x2. Now I still need to get rid of this 6. Right now I'm adding 6, so opposite operation is minus 6. What I do to one side, I do to the other. This cancels out. 2 minus 6 equals negative 4. So now we have to do the same thing for our y values. So the midpoint of our y's is going to equal our endpoints divided by 2. So my midpoint y value is negative 5. My endpoint y value is negative 2. I don't know the other endpoint, and divide by 2. Okay, so now we need to get y2 by itself, so opposite operation. So instead of dividing by 2, we're going to multiply by 2. What we do to one side, we do to the other. this cancels out. We have negative 10 equals negative 2 plus y2. Opposite operation to get rid of the minus 2. So opposite is plus 2. What we do to one side, we do to the other. So we end up with negative 8 equals y2. So our answer is negative 4, negative 8 as one of the endpoint values. Okay, so number 6, determine if the following figure is a square or rectangle. Okay, well, for a square, all sides are the same length. Okay, so we can just find a way to find the distance of each side and see if they're all the same. Okay, so I could use the distance formula, but because it's a straight line, I want to find the easiest way to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and just count, right? So if I start here, because I have a vertical line, I'm only moving in one direction, I can count, and I'm moving 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the distance here is 5. Now let's look in this direction, and we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The distance here is 6. So because they're not even, this shape is a rectangle because 6 does not equal 5. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to number 7. Okay, so number 7, we want to determine the distance from A to B. So from A to B. So point A is at 1, 2. Point B is at 2, negative 1. Okay, so distance means we have to use the distance formula, which is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Okay, so we can just go ahead and plug that in our calculators. So I'm going to hit second square root, which the square root is right here. Second square root. And I'm going to put a parentheses. My x value, so I'm just going to make the b's x my 2. Okay, so 2 minus 1 squared plus parentheses. I have to use the same order, so negative 1 minus 2 squared. So again, make sure you use the same order. If I use this as my second point, you have to use it as your second point for both x and y. Okay, so I hit enter. And I get 3.16227766. It says round to the nearest tenth. Tenth is one place after the decimal. Okay, so that means if I have 3.16227766, the 10th place is this first place after the decimal. So I look at this number to see if it's 5 or greater. If it's 5 or greater, I round up. So it ends up being 3.2. Okay, if we go to number 8, determine the midpoint of the side DC. So if XY is the midpoint of DC, we also then want to add those values. So first off, we just need to determine the midpoint. So D is at 4, 3. 4 is our x value. 3 is our y value. C is at 5, 0. So midpoint is just the average of our x's and the average of our y's. So midpoint is going to equal x1 plus x2 divided by 2 and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So let's start with our x's. So 4 plus 5 divided by 2. So 4 plus 5 is 9 divided by 2. Okay, and then our y's, we have 3 plus 0 divided by 2, which equals 3 over 2. And so they ask us to put this as a decimal, so I can get my calculator out. 9 divided by 2 equals 4.5. 3 divided by 2 equals 1.5. So my answer is 4.5, 1.5. And then if I add my x and my y together, 4.5 plus 1.5, I get 6. Okay, so number 9, which of the following represents the distance between those 2 points? Okay, so we're going to use the distance formula. So the distance formula equals x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So let's just go ahead and say this is x1, y1, x2, y2, and just plug in. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my calculator to help me out. Okay, so I'm going to clear this second square root, parentheses. So my x2 value is 4. My x1 value is negative 3. So you can hit either the negative 3 button, or we also know that a negative minus a negative equals a positive, and you could change it, but this would work just fine. Squared plus, now my y2 value is negative 2, so I'm going to do new parentheses, and negative 2 minus 5 squared, and enter. So my answer is 9.89949. Okay, so that's probably good. So I look over at my answers and I say, uh-oh, it's not showing. But I do know that this could be something different, this 7 square root of 2 as a decimal. So let me just go ahead and put 7 square root of 2 in my calculator. And, woohoo, I find that it equals 9.89949. And so that is my right answer. So remember, guys, if you have a decimal, you can go ahead and just convert all the other things. If it's a fraction or a square root, convert that to a decimal and compare your answers. Okay, almost there. 2 more questions. So number 10. In the standard XY coordinate plane below, R is located at 1, 0. So R is 1, 0. S is located at 1, 2. And T is located at 4, 0 to form a right triangle. Okay, so it says, what is the slope of ST? So I know that slope equals y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So I'm just going to go ahead and make this my x1, y1, and this is going to be my x2, y2. So slope is going to equal 0 minus 2 over 4 minus 1. So negative 2 over 3. So let's see if we have an answer. Woo! And we do. Okay? So, last question. So, in the standard coordinate plane, looks like it's the same triangle. So R is located at 1, 0, S is at 1, 2, T is at 4, 0. Okay, what is the midpoint of ST? So midpoint, we got this one down now, is going to equal the average of our X values and the average of our Y values. Okay, so X values, right, and Y values. So I'm going to take 1 plus 4 and divide by 2, and I'm going to take 2 plus 0 and divide by 2, because my X's divide by 2 and my Y's divide by 2. So 1 plus 4 equals 5. Divide by 2. 2 plus 0 is 2. Divide by 2. So our answer is 5 over 2, 1. Woohoo! Okay, and that is the practice test. Good luck, everyone, on your real test.